The house buzzed with chatter and laughter as the Johnson family gathered for their monthly tradition of family evening. Mark had insisted on hosting this time, eager to bring everyone together. He loved how these gatherings showcased their unity, despite the occasional flare-ups of familial drama. His wife, Laura, had been the perfect hostess all afternoon, orchestrating the kitchen, arranging the seating, and ensuring their suburban home exuded a warm, welcoming vibe. Mark couldn't help but admire Laura's charisma as she flitted around the room. She was wearing a sleek, emerald green dress that complemented her sharp cheekbones and radiant smile. Her presence always lit up the room. Tonight, however, she seemed more animated than usual, her laughter a touch louder, her glances across the room sharper. Laura's stepfather, Gregory, was a recent addition to these gatherings. A few years younger than Mark's father, Gregory had a magnetic charm that often became the focal point of any room he entered. His humor was dry, his wit quick, and Laura seemed to share a unique connection with him, one that always sparked playful teasing and knowing smiles between them. As the evening wore on, Gregory offered to help Laura with dessert preparations in the kitchen. Mark, engrossed in a lively debate about sports with his brother, thought nothing of it. Laura often recruited others to help her manage the evening's flow. It was part of her charm. In the kitchen, things took a different tone. Gregory leaned against the counter, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, tanned forearms. "You know," he said, watching her pull a pie out of the oven, "you've outdone yourself tonight. Mark's a lucky man." Laura's response was a soft laugh, though her cheeks flushed faintly. "He tells me that all the time," she said, setting the pie down to cool. Their eyes met briefly, a charge sparking in the air. Unseen, Mark's niece wandered past the kitchen, her footsteps soft on the carpet. Something about the stillness of the scene, Laura leaning a bit too close to Gregory, made her pause. But, hearing her father call her back, she hurried along without giving it much thought. The night continued with board games, wine, and music, but a subtle tension lingered between Laura and Gregory. Only the sharpest eyes might have noticed it, and Mark wasn't one of them. Yet, the family was midway through their favorite board game when Gregory excused himself, claiming he needed some fresh air. Laura stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I'll grab some more wine and check on him," she said casually, brushing off her husband's questioning look. Mark chuckled. He's probably just escaping Dad's endless stories about his college days. Everyone laughed, and Laura slipped out before anyone could object. Gregory was leaning against the backyard fence when Laura found him. His tie loosened and his posture relaxed. The dim garden lights cast long shadows across the lawn, and the hum of cicadas filled the night air. "You okay?" Laura asked softly, clutching the bottle of wine against her chest like a shield. Gregory glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, just needed a moment. Your family's lively." She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "You didn't seem yourself in there." Gregory chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm fine, Laura. Don't worry so much." But Laura wasn't convinced. She hesitated before speaking again. "About earlier," she began, the words catching in her throat. "What about earlier?" Gregory's tone was casual, but his gaze sharpened. Laura glanced back toward the house, ensuring they were alone. In the kitchen, it was nothing but— "It didn't feel like nothing," he interrupted, his voice low but firm. The distance between them seemed to evaporate as he took a step closer. "Laura, I think we need to—" "Sure," she hissed, panic flaring in her eyes. She turned toward the patio door, where a shadow flickered. Someone was coming. Mark's mother appeared, her cheerful voice cutting through the tension. "There you two are. Thought you'd run off. Gregory, come on back inside. You're missing the game." Gregory smiled politely and nodded. As he walked past Laura, he let his hand brush against hers, so fleeting that it might have been an accident. But Laura's breath hitched, and her grip on the wine bottle tightened. The game resumed without much fanfare, but Laura couldn't focus. She felt Gregory's presence like a magnetic pull, even from across the room. Her laugh came a little too quickly at jokes, her answers in the game a little too slow, and Mark occasionally gave her curious glances. When dessert was served, Gregory offered to help her carry the plates to the dining room. It was a harmless gesture in anyone else's eyes, but Laura hesitated a moment too long before nodding. Mark noticed but said nothing. In the kitchen, the air between Laura and Gregory crackled with unspoken tension. She passed him a stack of dessert plates, her fingers brushing against his hand for a second too long. He didn't pull away immediately, and she felt her pulse quicken. "This is dangerous," Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. Gregory leaned closer, his words measured. "Only if we let it be." Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered what might happen if she leaned into this storm instead of fighting it. But before either could say anything more, the sound of Mark's laughter boomed from the dining room, snapping Laura out of her thoughts. "We should get back," she said quickly, picking up a tray of pie slices. Gregory smirked, the edge of his lips curling up just slightly. "Lead the way." Back in the dining room, Laura plastered on a smile and served dessert. The evening carried on, but Mark felt a nagging sense of unease. Laura's energy was off. Her usual effortless charm felt strained, like she was holding something back. "Everything okay?" he murmured to her as the family chatted around the table. Laura nodded too quickly. "Of course. Just a little tired." Mark frowned, but before he could press her further, his sister called for everyone to toast to the Johnson family's bond. Glasses clinked, laughter erupted, and the moment passed. From his seat, Gregory raised his glass and locked eyes with Laura for a split second. Her cheeks flushed, and she quickly looked away. Mark's unease deepened, though he still couldn't pinpoint why. As the evening wore on, the family began to wind down. Mark's parents retired to the guest room upstairs, while his siblings gathered in the living room for one last round of drinks. Gregory lingered near the kitchen, helping Laura tidy up. Mark watched them from the corner of his eye, noting how Gregory seemed unusually eager to assist. He wanted to dismiss the thought, chalk it up to his stepfather-in-law simply being polite. But something about their proximity, how they moved around each other like pieces in a silent dance, nagged at him. "Babe, want me to help?" Mark offered, standing up and stretching. Laura glanced at him, startled. "Oh, no need. We're almost done. Go relax." Mark hesitated but nodded, retreating to the living room. His brother handed him a whiskey, pulling him into another conversation. Still, his mind lingered in the kitchen, replaying the glances and gestures he'd caught throughout the night. In the kitchen, Gregory leaned against the counter, watching Laura rinse glasses. "You're tense," he said softly. Laura paused, gripping the edge of the sink. "Greg, we can't keep this. Whatever this is, it has to stop." Gregory raised an eyebrow. "You mean the harmless conversations? The occasional glances?" His voice was light, teasing, but his expression was far from casual. "You know that's not what I mean," she snapped in a hushed tone, turning to face him. "You can't act like nothing's happening." Gregory stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You're right. Something is happening, Laura. We've both felt it." Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps in the hallway made them spring apart. Mark entered, carrying an empty bottle of wine. "Thought I'd bring this back," he said, his voice neutral, but his eyes searched Laura's face. "Thanks," she murmured, avoiding his gaze. Mark placed the bottle on the counter, his jaw tightening. "Everything okay in here?" Gregory's easy smile returned as he clapped Mark on the shoulder. "Just catching up with Laura. You've got yourself a remarkable wife, you know?" Mark forced a smile. "Yeah, I do." His tone was steady, but the air between them felt charged. Gregory excused himself, retreating to the living room. Laura busied herself with the dishes, her back to Mark. Mark hesitated, wanting to say something but unsure of what. Finally, he turned and followed Gregory, leaving Laura alone with her racing thoughts. The evening finally drew to a close, with Mark's siblings saying their goodbyes and his parents heading upstairs to bed. Gregory, ever the charmer, lingered by the door, exchanging handshakes and back pats. Laura stood a little apart, clutching a glass of water as if it were an anchor. "Mark, always a pleasure," Gregory said, gripping his stepson-in-law's hand firmly. "You too, Greg." "Thanks for coming," Mark replied, forcing a smile. Gregory turned to Laura, his gaze lingering a fraction too long. Laura, dinner was incredible as always. You've outdone yourself. Laura nodded, her response clipped. Thank you. Drive safe. As Gregory walked down the driveway to his car, Mark watched Laura's expression shift. Her tension was palpable, her posture stiff. You okay? He asked, closing the door. Laura jumped slightly, then smiled. A brittle, too bright expression. Of course. Just tired. Mark nodded, but his unease deepened. I'll lock up. Why don't you head upstairs? Laura hesitated, but eventually nodded, retreating to their bedroom. Mark moved through the house methodically, checking locks and flipping off lights, but his mind was elsewhere. As he passed the kitchen, a glint caught his eye. On the counter sat a glass of wine, still half full. It wasn't Laura's usual habit to leave a drink unfinished. Mark frowned, picking it up. The faintest lipstick mark on the rim matched Laura's shade. He stared at it for a moment, then poured the wine down the sink. When he joined Laura upstairs, she was already in bed, her back turned to him. Good night, Mark said, climbing in beside her. Good night, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Mark stared at the ceiling, his gut twisting. Something wasn't right, and whatever it was, he was determined to find out. The morning after the family gathering, Mark awoke to find Laura already up. Her side of the bed was cold, and faint sounds of movement drifted from the kitchen. He found her at the sink, staring out the window as she absently stirred a cup of coffee. You're up early, Mark said, trying to sound casual. Laura startled, but quickly recovered. Yeah, I couldn't sleep. Mark poured himself a cup of coffee, watching her closely. Everything okay? You seemed off last night. She hesitated, gripping her mug tightly. I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind, I guess. Mark wanted to press her, but something in her demeanor warned him not to push too hard. Instead, he changed the subject. I was thinking about heading to the gym later. Want to come? Laura shook her head quickly. No, I've got errands to run. You go ahead. Mark nodded, though her abruptness only deepened his suspicion. Later that afternoon, as he rummaged through the closet for his gym bag, Mark came across a shoebox tucked in the corner. It was an ordinary box, but something about the way it was shoved behind a stack of old coats caught his attention. He pulled it out and opened the lid. Inside were old letters and photographs, a collection of keepsakes from their early days together. But nestled among them was something that didn't belong. A small, folded piece of paper with Gregory's handwriting. Mark's chest tightened as he unfolded the note. Laura, you're incredible. Last night was unforgettable. Gee. Mark stared at the words, his mind racing. What did unforgettable mean? Was it innocent? His gut told him otherwise. When Laura returned later that evening, Mark's demeanor was calm, though his thoughts churned beneath the surface. Everything go okay with your errands? He asked casually. Yeah, she said, avoiding his gaze. Ran into traffic, though. Took longer than I expected. Mark nodded, filing her response away. He decided he needed to dig deeper before confronting her. Later that night, as Laura slept beside him, Mark unlocked her phone using her saved password. His heart pounded as he scrolled through her texts, finding nothing suspicious. But when he opened her hidden photo folder, he froze. There it was, a blurry photo of Gregory, smiling in their backyard from the night before. It was nothing overtly incriminating, but the fact that she had saved it sent Mark's mind spiraling. He set the phone down carefully, his mind made up. He would uncover the truth, no matter what it took. The next morning, Mark left for work early, though his mind wasn't on his projects or meetings. The note he'd found and the photo on Laura's phone weighed heavily on him. He decided it was time to start gathering answers. First, he called his brother, David. Hey, got a second? Sure, what's up? David replied, the sound of a bustling coffee shop in the background. Last night, did you notice anything off? Between Laura and Gregory, I mean? David paused. Not really. Why? Did something happen? Mark hesitated. No, nothing specific. Just a weird vibe. Well, Greg's always been a little, I don't know, smug? But I didn't notice anything unusual. You okay? Mark forced a laugh. Yeah, just overthinking, I guess. Thanks, man. Hanging up, Mark felt unsatisfied. David's perspective didn't align with what Mark's gut was telling him. At work, Mark couldn't focus. During lunch, he started scrolling through old photos on his phone from past family gatherings. There were countless group shots, but as he analyzed them, a pattern emerged. Gregory and Laura were often positioned closer together than seemed natural. In some photos, their body language bordered on overly familiar. By the time he got home, his suspicions had only grown. Laura greeted him with a kiss on the cheek, her usual warmth feeling forced. "How was your day?" she asked. "Busy," Mark replied. "Yours?" "Same. Ran a bunch of errands, like I mentioned yesterday." "Did you run into Gregory?" he asked casually, watching her reaction. Laura froze for half a second before recovering. "No. Why would you ask that?" "Just curious. You two seemed to get along well last night." Laura laughed nervously. "Well, he's family. It's not like we're strangers." Mark nodded, but her discomfort was all the confirmation he needed. That evening, he checked the home security camera logs. Most of the footage from the previous day was unremarkable. Laura leaving, coming back, running errands like she'd said. But something struck him as odd. The gap in the footage around noon. The cameras had been turned off and restarted an hour later. Mark's stomach sank. Laura had access to the system and could have disabled it deliberately. He knew he was piecing together a puzzle, but the edges were starting to fit. He decided it was time for a direct approach. Logging into their shared phone account, Mark accessed the call and text logs. Laura's number showed no unusual contacts, but Gregory's number, under the guise of a generic name, Gregory J., was there. The logs revealed late-night texts and missed calls, some from just a few hours after their family gathering. Mark stared at the screen, the betrayal becoming clearer. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself much longer. The confrontation was coming. Mark spent the next few days quietly piecing together the puzzle, his suspicions solidifying with each discovery. Laura's subtle evasiveness, the note from Gregory, the photo, and now the suspicious phone logs. It all painted a picture he couldn't ignore. One evening, after Laura had gone to bed, Mark called his closest friend, Nate. Nate was someone he trusted implicitly, a man who'd always been his sounding board during life's rough patches. "What's up?" Nate answered, his voice groggy but concerned. "I think Laura's cheating on me," Mark said bluntly. The line went silent for a moment before Nate responded. "Jesus, man. Are you sure?" "Not completely, but there's a lot that doesn't add up. Notes, calls, weird behavior." Mark hesitated. "And the guy, it's Gregory." Nate let out a low whistle. "Her stepdad? That's something else. What are you going to do?" "I need more proof," Mark said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "Something undeniable. But I can't do this alone. Can you help me?" "Of course," Nate replied without hesitation. "What do you need?" Mark explained his plan. He would wait for Laura to leave the house, then set up discrete cameras in key areas, the living room, kitchen, and even their bedroom. It felt invasive, but Mark needed to know the truth. The next day, Mark feigned a work emergency to ensure Laura would leave for a few hours. As soon as she was gone, Nate arrived with the equipment. Together, they set up the cameras and synced them to Mark's phone, ensuring he could monitor the footage remotely. "You sure you want to see this if something happens?" Nate asked as they tested the setup. Mark hesitated before nodding. "I don't want to, but I need to. I can't live with this doubt." By the time Laura returned, the cameras were in place, invisible to the naked eye. Mark greeted her as if nothing was amiss, though his heart raced with anticipation. That night, as Laura showered, Mark checked the cameras from his phone. For now, there was nothing unusual, but he felt a grim sense of patience settle over him. As he lay beside Laura in bed, staring at the ceiling while she slept, Mark knew it was only a matter of time before the truth revealed itself. 2 days passed with little incident. Mark monitored the cameras obsessively, though the footage yielded nothing unusual. Laura went about her days as usual, cooking, cleaning, and occasionally leaving for errands. Mark began to wonder if he was wrong, his paranoia getting the better of him. But then came Friday evening. Laura had been unusually quiet at dinner, pushing her food around her plate. When Mark asked if she was okay, she forced a smile. "Just tired," she said, the same excuse she'd used too many times recently. After dinner, she excused herself to go for a walk. "Want me to come with you?" Mark asked, though he already knew what her answer would be. "No, it's fine. I just need some alone time to clear my head," she replied, grabbing her coat. Mark nodded, watching as she walked out the door. The moment it closed, he pulled out his phone and opened the live feed from the cameras. At first, everything seemed normal. Laura strolled down the street, her figure shrinking into the distance. But after 10 minutes, the living room camera detected movement. Mark's breath caught as the feed showed Gregory stepping into the house. He was carrying a small bag and looked around cautiously before settling on the couch. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He watched as Gregory pulled out a bottle of wine from the bag and set it on the coffee table. Then he leaned back, checking his phone. Seconds felt like hours as Mark waited. He couldn't understand why Gregory was there alone, or if Laura would return soon. When Laura finally walked back in, her coat draped over her arm, her expression wasn't one of surprise. It was one of familiarity. "Did anyone see you come in?" she asked, her voice soft but audible through the microphone. "No," Gregory replied. "Relax." Laura sat down beside him, and Gregory poured them both a glass of wine. Their conversation was muted, their body language close but not overly intimate. Mark clenched his fists, willing himself to stay calm as he recorded the footage. "Mark's been acting weird," Laura finally said, her voice tight. "Has he said anything?" Gregory asked. "No, but I think he suspects something." Gregory shrugged, taking a sip of wine. "Let him. He's not going to figure it out." Laura hesitated, looking down at her glass. "Greg, maybe we should stop. This is getting too complicated." Gregory leaned closer, brushing her hair back from her face. "You don't mean that." Before she could respond, the sound of a car door slamming outside startled them both. Laura jumped up, peering out the window. "It's just the neighbors," she said, exhaling in relief. Mark's blood boiled as he watched the exchange, but he forced himself to wait. He needed to catch them crossing the line. He turned off the feed and stared at the ceiling, the weight of their betrayal crushing him. But it wasn't over yet. He knew he'd catch them red-handed soon. Mark woke the next morning feeling drained, his resolve hardening with each passing moment. The footage from the previous night was damning enough, but he wanted irrefutable evidence. Laura acted as though nothing had happened. She hummed to herself while making breakfast, occasionally glancing at Mark with a forced cheerfulness that made his stomach churn. "I thought we could have a quiet night tonight," she said, setting a plate of eggs in front of him. "Maybe order in and watch a movie?" Mark forced a smile. "Sounds good." Inside, he seethed. The audacity of her calm demeanor was almost impressive. When Laura left for the grocery store later that day, Mark revisited the camera footage. Gregory had left shortly after their conversation the night before, but not before hugging Laura, a hug that lingered a moment too long. He sent the footage to his closest confidant, Nate, with a single message: "This is happening." Nate called immediately. "Mark, this is enough. You've got them. What's your move?" Mark clenched his jaw. "I need more. Something he can't talk his way out of. Tonight, if they try anything, I'll catch them in the act." "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Nate asked, his tone laced with concern. "I have to be," Mark said simply. That evening, Laura suggested they eat dinner early. Mark agreed, watching her closely as she moved around the kitchen, her phone buzzing intermittently on the counter. She glanced at it once or twice, but didn't reply in his presence. After dinner, she excused herself, claiming she was feeling tired and wanted to take a bath. Mark nodded, feigning indifference as she disappeared upstairs. Once she was gone, he opened the live camera feed again. It didn't take long. 15 minutes later, Gregory slipped into the house through the back door. Mark's hands shook as he watched Laura emerge from their bedroom, her hair damp, wearing an outfit far too casual for the supposed bath she had taken. They met in the living room, their conversation hushed. Gregory reached for her hand, and this time, Laura didn't pull away. Mark hit record on his phone as Gregory leaned in, brushing his lips against Laura's. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then kissed him back. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and Mark's fury erupted. He grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, slamming the door as he left. The cameras caught Laura and Gregory springing apart, their faces pale with guilt. Mark didn't know where he was going yet, but he knew one thing. The confrontation would happen soon, and he was ready. Mark spent the night in the guest bedroom, his emotions ricocheting between rage and heartbreak. Every creak of the floorboards reminded him that Laura was still in the house, but he refused to face her again. The next morning, he woke early and began making calls. His first was to a divorce attorney, explaining the situation in clipped, emotionless tones. The lawyer assured him they could use the footage and texts to build a solid case. Afterward, Mark called Nate, who offered to come over and help. When Nate arrived, the two friends sat in the kitchen. Laura was upstairs, her footsteps occasionally echoing above. "Did she try to talk to you?" Nate asked, sipping his coffee. "She cried herself to sleep," Mark replied bitterly. "I don't care what she has to say. It's all lies anyway. You sure you don't want to hear her out?" Nate pressed gently. "No," Mark said firmly. "She made her choices. Now, she can deal with the consequences." Just then, Laura appeared in the doorway, her eyes swollen and red. She looked at Nate, then back at Mark. "Can we talk? Alone?" she asked, her voice shaky. Mark nodded toward Nate, who gave him a supportive pat on the shoulder before stepping outside. "What do you want to say?" Mark asked, his voice cold. Laura clasped her hands together, struggling to find the words. I don't know how to explain it. It was a mistake. I let things get out of hand with Gregory, but it didn't mean anything." Mark scoffed. "Didn't mean anything? You kissed him in our house. How long has this been going on?" Laura looked away, guilt written all over her face. "A few months," she admitted. Mark's jaw clenched. "A few months," he repeated. "And you had the audacity to sit across from me, to smile at me, to tell me you loved me, while you carried on with him." Tears streamed down Laura's face. "I do love you, Mark. Please believe me. I made a terrible mistake, but I want to fix this." Mark stared at her, his anger boiling over. "You don't love me, Laura. You love yourself. You love the thrill, the secrecy, the attention. If you loved me, this never would have happened." Laura broke down, sinking to the floor. "I'll do anything," she sobbed. "Therapy, counseling, anything. Please, Mark, don't throw us away." Mark looked at her, his expression hardening. "You threw us away the moment you let him into our home. There's no coming back from this." Without another word, Mark turned and walked out of the kitchen. He found Nate waiting in the driveway, ready to help him leave. "I'm done, Nate," Mark said as he climbed into the car. "Good," Nate replied. "You deserve better." As they drove away, Mark felt a bittersweet sense of relief. He'd lost his marriage, but he'd reclaimed his self-respect. Mark spent the next few days staying at a hotel, needing space to clear his head and strategize. His attorney assured him the divorce would move quickly given the overwhelming evidence of Laura's infidelity. Still, a lingering bitterness gnawed at him. She hadn't just betrayed him. She had made a mockery of their marriage, of the life they had built together. Gregory's smug arrogance only added fuel to the fire. Mark wasn't going to walk away without making sure both of them felt the consequences of their actions. After consulting with his lawyer, Mark devised a plan. First, he contacted Gregory's ex-wife. She and Gregory had divorced years ago, but they had a child together, a son in his late teens. Mark wasn't close with her, but they'd crossed paths at family events. "Why are you calling me?" she asked warily. Mark took a deep breath. "Because you deserve to know who Gregory really is. He's been having an affair with Laura, my wife. I have evidence if you need it." There was a long pause before she responded. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Mark replied. "I'm not asking for anything, but I thought you might want to know. Especially for your son's sake." Her voice turned icy. "Thank you for telling me. I'll handle it." Next, Mark compiled everything, texts, video footage, and a timeline of events, and sent it anonymously to Gregory's workplace. Gregory prided himself on his professional image, but Mark knew the affair would tarnish his reputation. The final piece of his plan came from a chance encounter. While packing up the last of his things from the house, Mark ran into their neighbor, Mrs. Campbell, who had a penchant for gossip. "Mark, I heard you've been staying away from home," she said, her eyes alight with curiosity. Mark hesitated, then decided to give her exactly what she wanted. "Yeah, things have been rough. I caught Laura and Gregory together." Mrs. Campbell's mouth dropped open. "Gregory? Her stepfather?" Mark nodded grimly. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't spread this around, but," he trailed off, knowing full well she would do the opposite. By the time Mark left the neighborhood, whispers had already begun circulating. When Mark returned to his hotel that evening, Nate called him. "You're really going scorched earth, huh?" "They deserve it," Mark said simply. "Fair enough," Nate replied. "But make sure you're doing this for you, not just for revenge." Mark leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city lights. Maybe it's both. It didn't take long for Mark's carefully planted seeds to bear fruit. Within days, the fallout from his actions began to ripple through Laura and Gregory's lives. The first sign came from Gregory's workplace. His boss called him in for a meeting after receiving the anonymous email. While the company couldn't fire him outright based on personal conduct, the scandal spread among his colleagues like wildfire. Gregory's once commanding presence in the office was now met with whispers and side glances. Clients began requesting other representatives, and Gregory's reputation was irreparably damaged. The second blow landed closer to home. Mark's conversation with Gregory's ex-wife had sparked a confrontation between her and Gregory, resulting in a full-scale family rift. Gregory's son, disgusted by the affair, refused to speak to him. Gregory's once strong relationship with his son was now in tatters, leaving him isolated. Meanwhile, Laura faced the consequences of her betrayal in a far more personal way. Mrs. Campbell's loose tongue ensured that the neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Whispers about the affair with her stepfather spread like wildfire, and Laura found herself ostracized from the social circles she once cherished. Mark, watching from the sidelines, felt a mix of satisfaction and melancholy. The revenge hadn't dulled his pain, but it had restored a sense of balance. Laura attempted to reach out several times, her texts and voicemails alternating between apologies and pleas. "Mark, please, can we just talk? I need to explain. I know I hurt you, but this doesn't have to end like this. Let's try therapy. You're destroying me. Do you even care?" Mark read each message with a cold detachment, deleting them without reply. One evening, Nate invited Mark over for dinner. "Looks like your plan worked," Nate said as they sat on the back porch, beers in hand. "Yeah," Mark replied, staring into the distance. "She's getting what she deserves." "And Gregory?" Nate asked. "Him too. His son won't even speak to him anymore." Nate leaned back in his chair. "So, what now? You've burned it all down. What's next for you?" Mark exhaled, the weight of the question settling over him. "I don't know. Move forward, I guess. I've already started looking for a new place. Somewhere fresh, where I don't have to think about all this." "That's good," Nate said with a nod. "You can't let this define you." Mark took a sip of his beer, feeling the first hints of hope stirring within him. He had survived the storm. Now, it was time to rebuild. A month after the confrontation, Mark stood in his new apartment, surrounded by unopened boxes. The space was small but modern, with large windows that filled the rooms with light. It was a blank slate, a chance to start over. The divorce proceedings were already in motion, and his attorney assured him things would be finalized quickly, given Laura's lack of resistance. She had made only one demand: to meet him in person to apologize. At first, Mark refused, but as the days passed, he began to reconsider. Not for closure, he felt he'd already found that, but to ensure she understood the weight of her actions. They met at a coffee shop near Laura's workplace. She arrived first, sitting nervously at a table near the window. When Mark walked in, she stood, wringing her hands. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice tentative. Mark nodded and sat down, waiting for her to speak. "I don't even know where to start," Laura began, her eyes welling with tears. "I betrayed you in the worst way possible, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed you to know how sorry I am." Mark's expression remained neutral. Why did you do it, Laura? That's all I want to understand. She hesitated, wiping her eyes. I wish I had a good answer. I think I was bored, insecure, looking for something exciting. Gregory, he knew how to manipulate that. But none of that excuses what I did to you. Mark let her words sink in, his emotions surprisingly calm. You're right, it doesn't excuse it. But I've moved past needing your apology, Laura. What you did shattered the trust between us, and there's no rebuilding from that. Laura nodded, her shoulders sagging. I understand. I just wanted you to hear it from me, not through texts or lawyers. Fair enough, Mark said, standing. Goodbye, Laura. I hope you figure out what you're looking for. As he walked away, he felt lighter. The chapter was closed. Weeks turned into months, and Mark began to rebuild his life. Therapy helped him process the pain, and he slowly began to trust himself again. He leaned on friends like Nate and pursued new hobbies, cycling, cooking, and even traveling. One evening, while scrolling through his phone, he came across an email from a woman named Rachel, a friend of Nate's who had heard about his ordeal. Hi, Mark. I know we don't know each other, but Nate thought we might get along. I'm a divorcee too, and I wanted to say you're not alone. If you ever feel like grabbing a coffee, let me know. Mark smiled for the first time in weeks. Maybe this was the start of something new. Mark's journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt ready to embrace the future, knowing he'd survived the worst and come out stronger.